Good evening, everybody. My name is Paul Dominiak. I'm the senior tutor here, and I'm deputising for Julian Hubbard, the director of the Intellectual Forum. Warm welcome on this cold evening to Jesus College and the Intellectual Forum, whether you're here in person or viewing online. You may be more or less familiar with this college and the Intellectual Forum, and so I thought I'd give each a brief introduction. Jesus College was founded in 1496. At that point, the college consisted of buildings taken over from the nunnery of St. Mary and St. Radegund, which was founded at the beginning of the 12th century. The chapel is the oldest university building in Cambridge still in use and predates the foundation of the college by 350 years, the university by half a century. Over subsequent centuries, Jesus College has grown in size and in the size of its membership. Jesus College is now a community of more than 1,000 members, including around 500 undergraduates, around 400 graduates and research associates, and over 100 fellows, supported by more than 100 staff. The founding statute of the college states that it is a place of education, religion, learning, and research. As part of the statutory aim of the college, the Intellectual Forum was created in 2016. The IF is an interdisciplinary centre interested in the broadest range of issues. It focuses on bringing people together in person or virtually to discuss important topics of our time, as well as providing global education courses and conducting our own research. Amidst the many activities of the college in the IF, we carry forward the tradition of being a place of spiritual and ethical reflection on religious faith and its implications for both individuals and broader society. In that vein, it's a pleasure this evening to launch Dr. Claire Gilbert's new book, I, Julian, a fictional autobiography of the great English medieval mystic and theologian Julian of Norwich. Claire is a visiting fellow of this college and the director of the Westminster Abbey Institute. Claire is joined by Andrew Wilson, a writer and columnist, and Professor Janet Soskice, fellow of this college. In a moment we'll hear first from Claire, and then hear a response from Andrew and Janet, before turning to questions in person and online. But now I invite you to give a warm welcome to Claire.
Good evening. It's lovely to see you all. Thank you for coming out on a wet night. Julian was the one bright star in a dry as dust Oxford theology degree back in the 80s. She shone out as like nothing else, and I remained somewhat in love with her from then, and I ended up writing a doctoral thesis on her in relation to ecological consciousness. And then I got cancer, and had 2.5 years of really gruelling treatment for blood cancer, and Julian stopped being the subject of my academic interest and became a very close spiritual companion through those 2.5 years. And I, because they're selling the books here, I wrote about that, wrote about her and that journey in this book, which is a series of letters to people I wrote whilst I was having the treatment. Highly recommend it as a way of getting through something really grim, is to write about it in an unexpurgated way to people who know and love you. I wasn't intending to publish, that came later, but she runs through the book as the companion to my treatment, not least because of the kind of theology she espouses. She showed me how to walk towards the pain, smile at it, receive it, and porously, and to find joy on the other side of the pain, so that the cancer became not a source of bitterness, but a source of joy. And in writing those letters, I found my voice. So I've published other things about ethics, applied ethics, and some spirituality, but this was absolutely honest. These letters were absolutely honest. And as I came to the end of my treatment in July 2021, I conceived a desire, or I might even put it like this: I heard a call to tell Julian's story with the same depth of honesty that I'd found in the voice that my cancer gave me, you might say. Now, I didn't know, if I can put it like this, whether she would let me, because those who know her texts know that she wanted anything but that to be looked at herself. She said, she writes about visions that she had, and she wants us to look directly at the visions. She wants the encounter for the reader, the reader's encounter to be directly with the visions, not via Julian. And the power of her text is such that you do pretty much find that to be the case. So she doesn't want to be seen. So in this way in which I was connecting with her, you might say, I didn't know whether she would let me. But as it happens, it poured out of me, the story poured out of me like prayer, quite fast. The editorial process thereafter took longer. My editor is here and she knows all about it, so that took longer, but the story itself just emerged. So again, those of you who know something about Julian will know that it's not just that she doesn't want to be seen. We really can't see her. There's very, very little known about her. In fact, we cannot be 100% certain that the Julian of Norwich we know existed in the 14th century is the author of the text, Revelations of Divine Love, because the manuscripts are all much later. However, in the text itself, a woman, and it's clearly a woman, writes of having visions in May 1373. Next month is the 650th anniversary of those visions. And so we think it was probably her. But I was, in a sense, making a virtue of that uncertainty in order to be allowed to do something creative with her that was nevertheless true to the text as far as I could be, and also made something of the few facts that we do have. So the few facts that we do have are that there were 4 legacies left to Julian, recluse at Norwich, or anchoress at Norwich. Marjorie Kemp had an encounter with her. Marjorie Kemp wrote an actual autobiography, the book of Marjorie Kemp, and the manuscript for that is contemporary. So we know the person who wrote that book is the woman who met Julian. So that's an independent account of the person Julian and these late manuscripts. That's all we have. So I, in weaving this fictional autobiography and telling the story, I took those 4 legators and thought, well, how might they have known Julian? How did they end up leaving money to Julian? What would their relationship have been? So there is Thomas Emond, chantry priest at Aylsham, left her some money. In the Revelations, there's this completely brilliant passage really near the end, where you've read through all these extraordinary visions that she's had, and they happen at a liminal time at night, at the crisis of a fever. She's fallen ill, and she has these visions in the early hours of the morning, just when the fever reaches crisis. We read all about this and all her musings on them. It's a long book, and then she comes to, as it were, with the crisis of the fever past, wakes up, and she says there's a religious person sitting by her bed. And the religious person asks me how I fared, she says. And I say, says Julian, I raved. And I laughed, and she says, I laughed. And the religious person, and then she says, I methought I saw blood, a cross, bleeding. And she was laughing at herself. And the religious person doesn't laugh. he waxed serious. And she says, so I'm telling you this story so you know what an idiot I am, because if he hadn't done that, I would never have looked back at those visions, and we would never have had the revelations of divine love. So Thomas Emond becomes that religious person, this later benefactor. And so this is how the book begins. What would my life have been if you had laughed with the others when I said I raved, Thomas? I would not be here in this anchor hold, and I would not have written a word. In the silence where your laughter was not, the visions were real again, and all that my life became flowed from that moment, because my return to the fierce light of my meeting with Jesus banished everything else. There would be no second husband, no household to manage, no busy works of charity. I could not do those things again and attend to the visions. And if the visions were true, I had to choose them. And then I had to receive all that they showed me, more and more seeing, till the words to understand what I was seeing filled my heart and overflowed, and I had to start writing them down. And I understood that these words that I was writing were not for me, but so that others could see what I had seen. It was not safe to write. Not in English, not these dangerous words, and especially not as a woman. I had to trust that if I wrote the words, and they could be kept in secret, they would be read one day. Some think that to enter an anchor hold is to choose death. They are right. It is a kind of death, and one I welcomed. I knew death. I had walked towards its pain and loss, and I had tasted the joy that is the other side of the pain. So it was not a hard choice for me. Here was safety. Here I could take time, years and more years, to reflect on what I had seen and let it grow in me and write it down privily. I was alone and undisturbed. I did not need to guard my words, my dangerous truth, my woman's truth. And now I have finished the writing, and the words have been taken away from this place by hands that I trust, to wait until they can be read. The danger is passed from me. What is left, Thomas? An old woman on tired knees. Aside from prayer, my work is done. But here you are at my window asking for more words, not of the visions, but of my life. Mine. You say that when this long account of my visions finally comes to be read, perhaps many years from now, people will want to know who I am, and they will want to know about my life, because they will see me as their teacher. You whisper that I am a great teacher already. You are wrong. I am not a teacher, and I do not want those who read my words to see me. But, oh, Thomas, I owe you my life, this rich, anchored life. And I do have more words in me, and yes, they are of myself. They come in answer to a question that has never been far from me, a question that stays strong even as my body grows weaker, as it draws close to death once again, and this time with neither hope nor wish to return. Why? Why did these showings come to me, wretch that I am? Why? You believed me when I did not believe myself, Thomas, and I will tell you my life, and you perhaps will hear the answer to my question if I cannot. I will speak truly, but I will speak privately, for I will not have you make my life more important than the words I have written, which have gone from here. I do not want my story broadcast, Thomas. So I should just explain, this is the 14th century. There were proto-Protestants, followers of Wycliffe, Lollards as they came to be called, who were wanting to have the Bible translated into the vernacular, thought there was no point in having priests, thought the church was corrupt, and this heresy was rising up, and the Bishop of Norwich, Henry de Spencer, was actively pursuing heretics. So Julian was, and her text is dangerously close to Lollardism in some places. So Julian was aware that what she had to say was dangerous. So you could say that one of the reasons she chose a room of her own, to echo Virginia Woolf, was in order to be left in safety, in a safe place where she could reflect freely and write privately, without the fear of being accused as a heretic, and without the fear of the words being taken and used against her or in the wrong kind of way. The benefactor Roger Reed in my story becomes Julian's confessor after Thomas is sent to Aylsham. And in the midst of growing accusations of heresy and dangerous visions to recount, she trusts Roger Reed. John Plumpton, another legator, becomes Julian's steward, who falls in love with her and seeks her hand in marriage after her husband dies from the plague. She refuses marriage but gives him the business in return for a pension, and this pension helps fund her anchoress's life, for anchorites had to be self-supporting. Plumpton's legacy includes some money for Julian's former maid, Alice. In my story, Alice joins Julian's family as a child and serves Julian throughout her life, following her to the anchor hold to serve and protect her there until she chooses to become a hermit herself. And there is a legacy of a chalice from Alice, hermit. That's just a little scrap of thing, so I made that the same Alice. So, and the other benefactor, the fourth benefactor, Countess Isabel, comes to Julian for counsel, and Julian helps her lay to rest her unquiet grief for the loss through miscarriage of 13 unformed children. Isabel and Julian become fast friends, and she too supports Julian financially in her anchor hold. So I hope these are plausible characters acting plausibly in relation to the few facts that we have. But then there's a question of how Julian encountered the theological themes that are woven through the text. She claims to be unlettered, well, she clearly can write. She writes exquisitely. She, in my view, sits alongside Chaucer. She's a contemporary of his, with her exquisite prose. If he was the father of poetry, we might say she is the mother of prose, but without anything like the same kind of recognition. I work at Westminster Abbey, and it's my secret hope to get a memorial to her in Westminster Abbey next to Chaucer. That would be a thing, wouldn't it? So she claims to be unlettered. Now, in Norwich, there's a house on Elm Street. It stands there still. Elm Hill, sorry, I'm thinking of the film Elm Hill, which is a 15th century building, and we know in the 15th century 4 lay women lived there. We might call them proto-Beguines. Those of you who know about this movement of lay women, they call themselves Beguines. And I bring them into the 14th century, and they become Julian's companions and help her to heal after the terrible, terrible loss of her husband and daughter, for which she feels personally guilty. She does that classic woman's thing of just taking a tiny bit of time for herself, and in the time that she takes for herself, she feels absolutely imprisoned in the city, and the plague is everywhere. She goes into the woods just for a bit of respite, and when she comes back, her husband has died, and her husband has died, and her daughter is there with the dead body, and her daughter shortly after that dies. So she carries this terrible, terrible guilt that she just left her post for a moment and look what happened. And they bring her back to life, as it were, and she discovers a new God, partly through them and then through the visions. They are parchmenters. Now, this is one of the few trades that was available to women in the 14th century. And it solves the problem. When you're writing a story, you have to solve problems. One of the problems was where did Julian get the paper from? She's going to write her revelations. So they're the parchmenters who, as her friends, provide her with writing material, including when it's dangerous to do so. One of them, Felicia, is scholarly, and she introduces Julian to books such as The Cloud of Unknowing and Dionysius's Hid Divinity. Julian doesn't mention these, but you can see these sorts of ideas in her text. They also take Julian to hear the preaching of Dominicans and Augustinians who had a mission to teach the laity, and we know there was a lot of that kind of activity in Norwich at the time. So, through Thomas, Alice, the lay sisters, and Isabel, the life of an anchoress is explored. I'll just read. An anchorite. So Thomas has said that the abbess at Carrow is looking for an anchorite for the cell at the Church of St. Julian. And Julian says to Thomas, "What is that?" When we meet. "A hermit living solitary in a cell attached to a church." "I have not heard of such a life," I say. "Are there such in Norwich?" "There are few in Norwich today, but hermits stand in a long tradition, a line going back all the way to St. Anthony of Egypt in the 4th century. He sought refuge from the busy city by fleeing to the desert to pray alone as Jesus did. Since then, many have found different ways to be alone. To be alone. My heart moves strangely within me as I repeat your words, with joy. At least I think it is joy. Once you have entered the cell, Julian, you never leave it. You die to the world. You are under vows like a nun, but the vows are made directly to the bishop, and he is responsible for you. How do I live if I cannot leave the cell, I ask? You will need friends who will support you because you cannot work for a living. John's pension. And you can have a maid. Alice. Could I? Would she? She lives in a room next to your cell so she can come and go for you, to buy and prepare food and serve you. But you are as one who has died to the world, remaining always in your cell, attached to the church. You attend Mass daily by witnessing it through a window onto the sanctuary. The rest of your prayers you make alone. Your cell is not entirely enclosed. There is a window onto the world, and people come to seek your counsel. St. Anthony was not left in peace, and nor is an anchorite. Hermits have always been sought after for their wisdom and the holiness they cultivate in their daily prayer and contemplation. So although you are alone in your cell, you are also porous to the world, and the world can find you. But you can draw a curtain across the window, and your maid should help you to protect your solitude. I speak to Alice. Will you be bored? She asks bluntly. And if I can just interrupt my reading for a moment. As I've been talking about this book, Julian, this is something that's come up again and again. Wasn't it really, really boring? And it has been one of my endeavours in the book, as well as to have quite a pacey, dramatic external story. There's also a pacey, dramatic internal story, because for those who take this work seriously, this inner journey is anything but boring. A monk I spoke to recently said it's like the film The African Queen, only worse. It is really, really dramatic, this internal journey. So, will you be bored? I don't know, I reply. Alice laughs. I don't think you will be bored, mistress. I speak to the lay sisters. Their responses are characteristic. Margaret says, "How will you keep healthy if you cannot walk and feel the sun on your face?" Berta says, "The widows will miss you, but they can visit you, can't they?" Matilda says, "What will you wear?" And Felicia says, "I have heard lately of a manuscript written about a hermit called Richard Rolle. I will find out if we can borrow it." Felicia understands the choice I'm moving towards and is warm in her support for me. But when we speak on our own, she says, "Your visions are compelling and there is much to say about them, much there that will help others. But we both know that they do not sit comfortably with all that Holy Church teaches us. I want to be sure you are not choosing this life in order to hide your wisdom away from the world, as women so often do. No, Felicia, I say. The visions are for others, and I must offer them. But I need to reflect on their meaning in safety, in a place where I will not be seen and interrupted. I know they may be dangerous. And if you stood on a hilltop and told the world openly about them, you would be silenced. Felicia cuts across me, and her voice holds bitterness. All your words would be stolen by a man and claimed as his, or believed to have come from a man. So, I have to find my own way, I reply. Like Richard Rolle. He had to wear women's clothes, remember? He borrowed his sister's dresses and made a habit for himself when he decided to be a solitary. We both laugh at the irony. I will find my own way to tell the vision's truth in my own room, on my own terms, and nobody need know till I am ready to tell it. Felicia is satisfied. I tell Isabel of my possible calling, the Countess. Where is the anchor hold, she asks, when I have tried again to explain what an anchoress is. St. Julian's at Conisford, I reply. We must visit your namesake church, she says. I want to see what your grave is like, don't you? I cannot resist her, chiefly because I too really wish to see it. And they ride on horses to go and see it. Isabel produces a couple of horses and off they go. Isabel and I are seated astride like huntswomen. We move forward, followed by the groom and Alice, clip-clopping through the trees. I feel the warm sun on my back, the rippling, strong movements of the horse beneath me, and I notice how the things of nature are even more alive to me as I feel their life through the life of the magnificent beast that bears me. The sharp green new leaves of the birches shimmering in the light, the intoxicating smell of the may, its frothy blossom bud bursting on the blackthorn, the new ferns unfolding, the springy grass under the horse's hooves, this twisted tree trunk and the ivy that clings to it, the rich, fresh green that is emerging everywhere. Seeds germinate, sap rises, birdsong erupts, spirit lifts and expands and loves all that is made. It is so very good. I am knowing and loving God's green world more deeply than ever, even as I am proposing to withdraw from it. We emerge from the trees into an open field, and Isabel looks at me and laughs a devilish laugh and dares me to ride faster. How can I refuse? I am alarmed when the horse begins to trot, jiggling me so much I fear I will fall. But Isabel calms me, tells me to clasp his body with my thighs so I can really feel the movement of the palfrey and match my body's movement to his, not jiggling on him, and she lets me try this till I'm comfortable, and then, excitement rising in her voice, her horse pawing and snorting and pulling at her restraining hands, my own horse responding, she tells me to sit firm in my saddle, shorten my reins, keep my head up, my heels down, my shoulders back, and go. Her horse flies forward, and mine follows with a leap into a thundering rush that truly feels like flying, and it is so free and terrifying, and I clutch the horse with my thighs and keep my head up, and I dare not look behind me to see how Alice fares. And then somehow I soften into the speed, and it no longer seems too fast, rather that the horse is moving at the speed of the world, and we are all flying in exhilarating, joyful, exuberant nature. And then gradually, Isabel brings her horse down to a trot, and mine follows, and then to a walk, and we calm ourselves, breathing deeply and gently, and I can feel my horse calming beneath me, and all our heart beats slow, and quiet descends. And we walk like this across the Bishop Bridge into the city, following the bend of the river to Conisford, and the church of St. Julian, my future home perhaps. From my seat on my powerful flying palfrey, it looks small, enclosed, and small. And then finally, I thought I would just very briefly read you one of the visions. And I should say, I wanted this to make sense to a 21st century audience, to, if anything, if nothing else, to capture the imagination. These words which are from such a long time ago, and these actions which are from such a long time ago. So making sense of going into an anchor hold, making sense of the interior journey, and also making some kind of lively sense of the visions themselves. And I should say that this is possibly the most audacious bit of the book, because that's what she does in her recounting of them. And I somehow had to, it was no good just quoting them. You know, I had to tell them myself, which meant I had to take them deep into me and somehow see them again myself. So this is right at the beginning. I cease to question and simply watch. And now, in the light shed by the cross, I see a young woman barely out of childhood. Her eyes are fixed on me, and I do not think she sees me. Her lips are parted in an astonished, "Oh!" And her eyes, in her eyes I see intense concentration and fear, or is it awe? I understand in my heart that this is Mary as she was when she conceived, and she is, even now, receiving God into her body. I see her again, Thomas, as I speak to you, and she is looking into my eyes, and I can feel in my body the dread that she felt, and I understand it better, because the visions came to birth in me, and they too are so much greater than I. In her conceiving of God, Mary was a poor creature of no consequence, as am I. Why does God come to such as we? I have so often wondered. It is why I wanted to speak my story to you. Is it because we know we are nothing? Out of nothing, something is coming to birth. Seeing Mary receive the Creator of the universe into her own body breaks open my own being to receive what is to come, not just to witness, but to receive into the heart of me all its strangeness and size. To be transformed as Mary is transformed by her receiving. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire, for such a vivid introduction to a wonderful book. We're very keen to have a conversation around this piece of work this evening, but to help us begin that conversation, I'm just going to invite our two panellists, Janet and Andrew, to give their initial impressions.
Well, I've agreed to go first, and it's a great pleasure. This is a much-loved book, a book that was neglected for a long, long time, suppressed, vilified, hidden, only kept in a few copies in convents on the continent, wasn't it, Claire? Yeah. And yet it can't be suppressed. It's fascinating that we should be, as Paul in his introduction indicated, having this launch here at Jesus, which was a Benedictine convent for over 200 years before Julian wrote. And as a theology fellow at this college when I came over 30 years ago, it was a great pleasure to me to walk around the cloister and think that women have been reading St. Augustine here for 1,000 years, and I'm doing it now too. It's an amazing legacy of religious life that has sort of gone underground in some ways, like the text of Julian. But as Claire's indicated, we know so little about Julian. We do know that hers seems to be the first work of a woman writing in English that we can identify, not just a work of theology, but any work in English by a woman that we can identify as by a woman. We do know that she died in May of 1373, aged 30 and a half,
We had her visions then.
She tells,
Die.
pardon me, yes, that's quite right. She nearly died. She was halfway through death. And we do know it took her 20 years meditating on these visions to come up with her final long text reflections on what happened. And as Claire noted, and a number of the commentators say, Julian was, the self-facingness is quite characteristic of writing of the time, of religious life of the time, and now. You know, when you enter religious life, you take a religious name and you bury your old identity in some ways. So the scholars speak of the studied anonymity of Julian's text. There's very few details, but we do know quite a lot of details of her times. Historians have brought that to life, times of plague, times of war, and of course what Claire has done, which is quite remarkable and wonderful, and whether Julian would have liked it or not, as she said, is she's gone, having researched this whole area for her doctorate and out of interest over many years, gone back and thought, what would it be to be a child in Norwich with this kind of agriculture, this kind of household, this kind of economy? The plagues, I think the plagues came through you have her, the first pestilence comes through when she's 7. And what might that be? And you've woven it very nicely in with the things she actually says in the book. How can it be that such life of cruelty, because even if we don't know, I mean, as you've gathered, and some of you will know the book very well, we have no idea if Julian married, we have no idea if she had a child. In Claire's revivification, she both marries and is widowed and loses this child. But yet we do know that she lived amongst women, that she seems to have had this experience when she was 30 and a half in the household of her own mother, that the priest came before her saying the last rites with a crucifix, holding the crucifix before her. She sees this transforming vision, various sequences of visions, blood, the crucifix is bleeding, the crown of thorns, and so on. So we know a few details, and we know more about the surroundings, and as Claire has explained, she's woven this wonderful thing together to help us come back on what might the life of a woman of that period look like. But more than that, Claire, as you can tell from the reading, brings a sort of animation and true love of Julian. And from what you say, Claire, I'm searching for the correct word because I don't want to say this is an inspired text, but this came to you at a difficult time. You wrote this out of COVID, out of your own experience of being very ill and suffering a great deal. And that's everything that happens to a writer comes into the book. And yet a great joy. Everyone who meets you knows about your joy and liveliness and address of life. I love the part where you're reading about them galloping across to Norwich. And you get that even in the Julian text, because in some ways this kind of piety, women looking, feeling themselves, imagining themselves at the foot of the cross, seeing themselves there with Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Mary Magdalene at the foot of the cross, and meditating on Christ's wounds. This became a sort of heightened means of devotion in medieval Europe, and it was particularly fashionable amongst women. It was so-called somatic piety, because they identified with the suffering of the women at the bottom of the cross. They could identify physically with Jesus. But yet Julian takes this in quite a different, in almost a light-hearted tone some way. There's really often very humorous bits about Julian, but you can say humorous or just lively. For instance, when she's having this terrible experience, she thinks she's going to die, and her parish priest comes around and he sets the cross before my face and says she could no longer speak. She's lost feeling in the lower part of her body. She says, I've brought before you the image of your Maker and Savior. Look at it and be strengthened. And she thinks to herself, well, she says, I was looking heavenward, and I thought what I was doing was good enough, because I was looking heavenward, where by the mercy of God I trusted to go. But nonetheless, I agreed to fix my eyes on the face of the crucifix, if I could, because I thought maybe I'd be able to look straight ahead longer than I could look up. So it's quite, she doesn't want to bother the priest. She thinks, I'm looking up, what more do I need to do? And she just sort of does it to humor him. So there's all these things that break in to the text and make it very, once you get over thinking, oh, it's by a medieval woman and she's meditating on the crucifix, make it very humorous and lively. And these wonderful visions, which of course they are. She sees the blessed head of the God-man. She sees the blood pouring off it. But she describes the blood as like herring scales, or the blood flowing down like off a shingled roof. I mean, these are kind of deliberately sabotaging, because herring scales isn't, it's not really very romantic, is it? And yet she does this, the great intimacy and honesty about the book, which I think Claire tells us and truly has tried to capture, but also that overwhelmingly, this is a book about love, and I think that's why it's become so popular. Of course, there are adjacent things, the fact that Julian styles Christ as our mother because he's on the cross, he's in labor, and he gives birth to the church. He gives birth to us as a mother does. He feeds us with his body and blood as our mothers do. But all the while through, there's this whole continual repetition of a kind of a recursive nature of the text, folding back on itself, bringing you back and again to the visions, looking at them from one side to another, and enfolding us. So one of the editions calls itself Enfolded in Love. And I thought that's very apt, because she says, God is all that is good and gently enfolds us. God showed me spiritually how intimately he loves us. I saw that he is everything that we know to be good and helpful. In his love, he clothes us, enfolds and embraces us. That tender love completely surrounds us, never to leave us. And I saw that he is everything that is good. And here comes the famous, if you know nothing of Julian, you will know this. And he showed me more, a little thing, the size of a hazelnut, on the palm of my hand, round like a ball. And I looked at it thoughtfully and wondered, what is this? And the answer came, it is all that is made. I marveled that it continued to exist and didn't suddenly disintegrate. It was so small. And again, my mind supplied the answer. It exists both now and forever because God loves it. In short, everything owes its existence to the love of God. I mean, if you have one theological point in your head, that should be it. That all that is only is because it's held in being by God. It's wonderful that it's not in God's hand, unlike a hymn I learned as a child, but in her hand. She sees it as a tiny, fragile thing, but yet its existence is guaranteed because what holds it in being is God's love, and nothing, according to Julian, is more secure than that. That is the true Christian doctrine of creation, nothing about 7 days, but that all that is has its being now and then and forevermore as held in being by God's love. So thank you so much for this. It's probably enough from me. There's so much more that can be said, but I know Andrew wants to come in and maybe we can go to a conversation.
Well, I mean, I'd just like to echo what you say about Claire's book, because it does bring to life both this extraordinary woman and the world of the Middle Ages, which is in some ways so strange that you need fiction to revivify it. Anchoresses and anchorites were quite common during the 14th century and the 13th century before. And there's a famous book, if you study English, or any of you study English at some universities, I don't know here, called Advice to Anchoresses, the Ancrena Wissa. So we know quite a lot about what the way of life would have been for a woman like Julian, and you make use of the Ancrena Wissa, don't you, Claire, in this book. But and then one of the nice things about the Ancrena Wissa is that the person who wrote it, who was presumably a clergyman, recommends her not only to have a maid, but one cat, which I think was probably rather a luxury in the Middle Ages. And you do bring very vividly to life what it was like for her when she finally made the decision to have herself walled up in her cell. And you can still visit the repro cell in the bombed-out church in Norwich. And it's an extraordinarily moving place. There's a kind of electric atmosphere in that room. It's as if she is there. As has been said, she is the first, as far as we know, I mean, for all we know, Beowulf was written by a woman, but as far as we know, she is the first female author in the English language, together with her contemporary, Margery Kempe, who's been mentioned, who, both of them, interestingly, full of comedy, as has already been hinted. And Margery Kempe's put-downs of the various bores and pompous fools that she meets as she travels through the world, meeting priests who think she's a heretic and so on, are often very, very funny. And indeed, the closing of Margery's book, if you haven't read it, Margery Kempe's book, when she's coping with as we'd now say, caring for a demented husband, incredibly moving when she feeds him with her own fingers and so on. The core, as has already been said, of the Revelations is the love of God. But there's a deep paradox, of course, because she prays, before she even has the visions, that she will have illness, which is a very strange thing to pray, a very brave thing, some would say a very foolish thing to pray. And it's in the course of the illness, as has already been said, that the crucifix is held up before her, and she sees these, in many ways, horrific images of blood pouring. But as well as the hazelnut, the two things which I think everybody knows about this book, even if they haven't read it, is the theology which says love is his meaning. And that is the center of her vision of life. Love is so overpoweringly strong in the revelations of divine love by Julian that it seems to conquer even ethics itself. It seems to overpower the idea of good and evil or trying to obey the moral law, which I think is one of the very, very disturbing things about it. The other famous saying, immortalized by T.S. Eliot, that comes in the book, of course, is that all shall be well. Sin is behovely. You can't get rid of sin, either in your own life or in the world. We live in a fallen universe. We live in a sinful world. We live in a world full of pain. And instead of saying, isn't that awful, she just says, well, that's what happens. That's the universe we're living in. But all shall be well. And what enables her to say that is, on the one hand, she's been given the vision, and that is what creates the first book, the very short revelations of divine love. But then she has her lifetime experience as a contemplative, and as has already been said, being visited. It's a very big part of the hermit's life, this particular type of hermit, that people bring all their troubles and all their life experiences to her little window. So it's not just her experience, it's the experience of all these different people of both genders and all ages coming to her with their problems. All that is contained in the fuller version, which, as Claire has already told us, we only know about because it was copied out much, much later than her lifetime by pious ladies, religious sisters in Europe after the Reformation. But this core thing, love is his meaning, but as far as you and I are concerned, rather than navel-gazing, thinking, I'm so awful, I'm such a dreadful sinner, what can I do? Or the world's problems are so awful, what can we do? She has this sense, as does her great contemporary, Chaucer's already been mentioned, but Langland and the vision of Piers Plowman is very, very similar to her in his vision of life, of divine love being so powerful that it cascades like a cataract, like a waterfall through the whole of experience. And it transforms society, it transforms individuals, and as has already been said, of course, it transforms your philosophy of life, your idea of theology. I think I've said too much already, but thank you for writing this vivid reconstruction of Julian.
Thank you.
Huge thanks to Janet and Andrew for responding. We have about 25 minutes. I want to make sure that we all get to be part of a conversation. So I'm monitoring the Q&A online, but there are also the possibility of having questions from the room as well. Do wait if you're in the room for someone to appear with a handheld mic for you so everyone can hear you clearly and everyone can hear you online. I'll begin with the room first of all. Put your hand up if you have any initial questions, whether for Claire, Janet or Andrew. Gentleman right at the back, if you want to wait just for someone to come up with a microphone to you, that'd be wonderful. Thanks, Esther.
Do we actually know what she looked like exactly? Do we have any descriptions? And I guess we don't. So did you have an image in your head of what she looked like? Would you like to tell us what your image of her is?
Yes, the way she came to me was almost by contrast with Alice. So Alice was like an oak, was like an oak, and Julian was like a birch, or maybe a willow. So Alice was sturdy and strong with thick black hair and black brows and piercing eyes. And Julian had hazel eyes and sort of mousy hair that was always getting tangled when she was a little girl. And she was thin-boned and very, very sensitive. So I have this, and also in her cell, like a pupa, you know, I imagine her looking out at the sun and receiving her vitamin D that way. And she can see an apple tree in the garden that Alice tends by the anchor hold. But she's slender and yeah, hazel-eyed, a bit pale, like a birch or a willow.
Got some more on this side. The gentleman closest to me, and then Sean.
Thank you very much for the talk, all of you. I just wondered if any of you could talk a bit more about the hazelnut and what that image means to you, because it seems very specific to me, not just a nut, but a hazelnut. It reminded me as well of Jane Austen's novel Persuasion. In the novel, I just looked it up to remind myself, but Captain Wentworth uses the image of a hazelnut to express what he thinks the perfect human character is, and he's talking about endurance. He says he admires the hazelnut because it's outlived all the storms of autumn. And I wondered if... I have no idea if Jane Austen could have read the Revelations. I've got no idea what the publication history is, but...
A lovely thought, though, if she had.
Very unlikely, I think.
I guess. Well, so someone gave this to me yesterday. That's a shelled hazelnut. And she says, a little thing, the quantity of a hazelnut. So it may be the size of it that she's speaking of there. Because it is, if you look at it in the palm of your hand, it is tiny. But she's not looking at a nut. She's looking at something the size of a nut. And that is everything that is made. And it's so fragile. And it could fall at any moment. And in my reimagining of that vision, I have her thinking, I could close my hand on it. And this shock of power with this fragile thing, and then realizing that it was held by love. Therefore, God could never, ever, ever be wrathful, because if God were wrathful for 1 nanosecond, it would fall.
That's in a way the most I find liberating and exciting thing about the revelations of divine love, that she dismisses what's probably about 1/4 of the Bible as rubbish, because the notion that God is furious with you all the time, or thinks you're terribly naughty, is just a diseased part of your brain speaking to you. That is not the truth. And I mean, I think she's right in your novel to be afraid of heresy hunters, because I'm sure that is a kind of heresy. But obviously at the deepest level it isn't heresy, because it's true. But just thinking of you, it'd be lovely to think that Jane Austen had managed to read this book, but I don't think it's historically possible. But I think what you were saying earlier about creation isn't 7 days in which God gradually made things from the creatures right up to the universe. The mystery is existence itself, as Heidegger explores in his philosophy, as the Bhagavad Gita keeps on and on about. And the mystery of existence itself, of being, comes to you not when you're thinking necessarily of the entire universe or the stars or the solar system. Just one little thing the size of a nut is enough to do it for you. If you're on to what she's talking about, I think that's what it's about.
No, I think that's profoundly right, and of course it means that everything is held in being. It isn't something that happened. Creation isn't something that happened a long time ago, but it's now, and God is absolutely present to everything that is at all time, every place in its particularity, and that's something about the smallness of the nut too. I think it captures as well. It is about size, but the smallness of the hail in it. But it's the intimacy of God holding it in being. And certainly she comes very near to heresy of her day, and saying that she sees hell as empty, you know. Yes. And that wasn't what you're supposed to think of that day.
Think of the mystery place and how, or the paintings on medieval church walls of the souls in hell, or Dante himself. They loved thinking about hell. And indeed, you'll be able to correct me, but was it St. Bonaventure who thought one of the pleasures of the blessed was being able to sit on a kind of viewing platform and see the torments of the damned? But
Tertullian, I think.
So it's like watching reality TV. Yeah?
Watching reality TV. Whereas, I mean, Julian does, although in later ages she was regarded as a fanatic. I've just a thing here rather amusing by Edward Stillingfleet, Bishop of Worcester, who managed to read one of extracts from her and calls it the fanatic revelations of a distempered brain. That was the Age of Enlightenment's view of her. But in fact, she seems like the voice of common sense when you compare her with a medieval wall painting with the torments of the damned and devils sticking toasting forks into our unfortunate ancestors.
Really rich set of responses there. We had one more question on the front row.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Claire. I'm particularly addressing this question to you, and it's from a sympathetic devil's advocate. I'm really profoundly almost moved by the description of Julian's theology, which is revolutionary, but we might describe her as somebody suffering from post-traumatic distress disorder. And of course, her visions and her experiences have got to be within her cultural framework. There is no other way. But I wondered if you had been surprised by anything that you'd found in your experience, deep experience with the texts, and something which was surprising and out of the expected, perhaps, the expected range of experience. It's very impressive hearing the way in which, of course, she sees not an orthodox picture of heaven and hell, and that must be very strange. It is very strange and encouraging from my point of view. But I wondered if there's something particularly that surprised Julian herself more than that, or in another way.
She keeps saying, you know, this is what Holy Church says, and this is what I saw, and they're not always the same. But she does often say, but I'm not going to abandon Holy Church, and that tension is very much present in the book, and I hugely admire her for it, that she's not just going to jettison the institution, because there are things about it that don't make sense in relation to what she saw. She holds what seem to be mutually incompatible things in her mind because they both hold some sort of truth. But there are a couple of things that come to mind in response to your question. One is her absolutely brilliant reimagining of the fall, where the Lord sends the servant, so God sends Adam, you might say, asks Adam, gives Adam an order, gives the servant an order, and the servant runs to obey the order, and runs so fast that he trips and falls into a deep ditch, and he falls in such a way that not only is he in a great deal of pain, but he can't anymore. He's fallen, so his head is away from the Lord, who's up here somewhere. So he can't see that the Lord still regards him with fathomless love. And she's moaning and groaning, and that's her account of the fall. So it's not disobedience, it's over-eager obedience, which I think is brilliant. That's one thing. And then the other thing is something that I did. There's this conversation between Julian at the resurrection, you might say. So she's witnessed this terrible, terrible dying of Christ on the cross, which seemed to go on for a sennight, she says, for a week. It's dreadful. And then in a moment, she doesn't see him die, but his face, which is still ugly and disfigured, is full of cheer, blissful cheer. And she feels this blissful cheer in herself. So this disfigured, wounded Christ is now, as it were, risen. And he says to her, in the text, he says to her, "Art thou well apaid?" Which has the sense of satisfaction. Are you satisfied? And she says, "Yea, Lord, gramercy, I am." Now, while I was writing this and reflecting on it quite deeply, there was a really powerful encounter on Channel 4 News between someone called Tove Friedman, who's a Holocaust survivor, and Krishnan Murthy, the presenter, is that his name? And he says, she's been writing about and TikToking through her grandson about the Holocaust because he thinks people still need to hear it and there aren't many people left to tell the story. So here she is telling it. And she writes this book and goes on TikTok and things. And Krishnan says to her, "What's your view of God now with this experience?" And she says, she goes very quiet. And then she says, "This is very difficult." She says, "We talk about asking for God's forgiveness." She said, "I need to forgive God." It was so powerful. And it made me think again about this time in which Julian lived, where the pestilence, as they called it, wave after wave of the pestilence. There was climate change, there was famine. These were not, the church said, "Oh, it's our sins," but these were not things that anybody did deliberately. And one of her visions is about weal and woe coming backwards and forwards so fast. She knows she did nothing to deserve either the weal or the woe. So why? Why was there so much pain and suffering in the world? And this "art thou well apaid" dialogue with Christ in the story becomes that dialogue. And she suddenly is furious with God. And then Jesus says, again, this is in the text, "If I could have suffered more, I would have suffered more." This, in my understanding, is God is putting himself through Christ through this deep, deep suffering. Will you forgive? Is this enough? Will you forgive me? Is this enough? Is the sense of it? So that kind of emerged in the encounter with my own words and Tove, and so Tove Friedman is acknowledged because that was an extraordinary insight, which I felt actually was plausible.
Mm. And of course, the paradox of pain goes hand in hand both in your book but also in Julian's book with the notion of freedom. I mean, that's why she's such an exciting thinker as well as being an interesting person, because she believes in the totality of freedom. Most religious writers don't believe in freedom, and that's why they're religious writers, because they like the idea of systems which will control you. And there's no control in this book. It's a world without any control, and God has given the human race total freedom.
I think that what I see it is, it's a world where this is sort of agreeing and sort of not. It's a world of growth, and that comes in with her image of mothering and sowing, and also the fact, and this wonderful, the parable of the Lord and the servant, that the fallingness, the pain, isn't against what it is to be alive. It's part of what it is to be alive. And she talks about how a mother seeing her child learn to walk will know the child's going to fall and hurt themselves. But that's not, it's bad, yes, but the child has to learn. The child has to learn these things. And that you're right, a sort of certain kind of religious mentality wants to control everything so that there's no falls, there's no hurts, there's an answer for everything, slap it down, problem evil done. But actually she, in this revolving, this enfolding, this recursive nature of her texts, bring us back to the idea that it's about growth and movement and deepening your understanding, not with some ossified set of principles. And this is perhaps why the Enlightenment thinkers hated her so much.
I think they did, because she realized that reason, well, I mean, other people in the Enlightenment did, Immanuel Kant did, but reason will only take you so far. Mm-hmm. She was on to that, of course.
I want to give people over on the side of the room in a moment a chance to ask some questions. There's a group of questions online, Claire, directed to you. Just for you to comment upon how engaging with the work of Julian and writing your own fictional book about Julian helped you.
Oh, in so many ways. I mean, there's a lot, I suppose, about in the cancer treatment account. Yes, so these ways she teaches of, for example, holding what seem to be unmutual truths and not jettisoning them. And there's something that out of that comes growth, out of that comes greater understanding, because your mind has to get bigger in order to make sense of what seems to be mutually incompatible. The way she, and I think that's a very good exercise, you know, rather than take sides, rather than thinking in this controlling way, well, if these two things aren't compatible, I'm just going to have to choose one of them. But if there is truth in both, then don't choose. Wait and learn and let it make your mind grow. The way she keeps coming back and back and back to her visions in the text, there's this recursive thing, as we've been saying, and that's such a lovely teacher to say you don't have to close with anything. There will always be more to say and more to see, and never think you've got to the end of anything. So the learning and the growth can continue and will always continue and never come to an end. The thing I mentioned before about walking towards the pain and being porous to the pain. So my doctoral thesis was on her porosity, which I say is the way we need to be in relation to the planet. This is an answer to the mindset that we have inherited. It's an Enlightenment mindset, lots of good things about the Enlightenment, but it did make us think that we had to somehow objectify and control and make nature work for the good of humanity, and that has caused untold troubles. And we're not going to solve that by trying to solve the environmental crisis with the same mindset of control and solve and design and all those things. The designers have come, but they come in service of porosity to the world and seeking to learn from and serve the world, and that was what my doctoral research brought me to through Julian. So those are examples of the many ways in which he's helped me. If that was the question.
I'm sure that has answered people fitfully. We had two questions over here. Just want to put your hands up so we can see where you are.
Thank you. Claire, you were talking about how you think Julian always had this attitude to her visions of being able to learn more from them and grow. I wondered if you thought there are other lost Julian texts, whether she continued to write. You know, she wrote the short, she wrote the long. Did she write any even longer? Or is it something she continued to do for herself, perhaps,
yes,
as a way of processing?
That's a very, very good question, because in the book, I say that after she's finished writing the long text, but she takes a long time over it, and there's a point when she has to give up everything she's written before because she gets a greater understanding of one of the revelations, and that makes her look at all of it again. And anybody who's written a book knows what that feels like when you've done so much work, but actually you're going to have to, and I talk about her trying to fit things in between the lines. There's just not enough room, and she has to start again. So there's that, but then once the words, because it's getting more and more dangerous, the book is taken away from her cell, the danger has gone, that she doesn't write again. And the book is published, right? So I can't do anything about it. But I keep thinking, if she was a writer, she maybe might have wanted to write more, and maybe she did write more.
Am I right in remembering the longer text that, in a way, it is partly the story of living with the earlier text, isn't it? I mean,
well, we
and
don't.
to that extent, she is a bit like William Langland and the Vision of Piers Plowman. That you have the A text, the B text, the C text, and he's really a writer of one book, which he just keeps writing all his life and expanding. And I suspect, if there is an answer to your question, which obviously there couldn't be really, I suspect she would have been like that. She could have written a third version, but it would have been the same thing, wouldn't it?
Yes,
it would have been
I think that's right.
It would have been an expanded idea of all the themes that we've been trying to touch upon.
Yeah. Right at the end, she says, "This book is not yet performed."
Mm-hmm.
But she then, in my understanding, she then rather puts it upon us to continue the performance.
Yes, well, that was what I loved about both the whole book, but also some of the bits you read out. It is on us, and it was also on the people who came to her window. She would have said some of these things to them.
Mm. Yeah.
Thank you. And our next question, immediately next door.
Thank you very much. It's all very interesting. Slightly more on a personal note, if that's all right. Over the centuries, we had plenty of mystics who wrote way much more than Julian and whose lives are way better recorded. And kind of putting aside your story of cancer and going back to the beginning, what made you fall in love so much with Julian? Because I think it's the way she writes is extremely extraordinary. It's not only against what the church taught at that time, but her relationship with God is so deeply personal. It's almost the level which in 21st century is very often not accepted. And so that's something that speaks to me. What was for you the thing that made you fall in love with her?
I don't know that I could articulate it, or if it was when I was an undergraduate. It was that term of doing the mystics. That was the best term of the whole 3 years, and Julian was the best of that group. And I mean, this is just remembering with hindsight, so I don't know, but it's not a million miles from what you're saying. The candor of the relationship, the porosity of the relationship. And
did you concentrate on the English mystics, Walter Hilton and Richard Rowe and so
it was Julian, Cloud of Unknowing, Teresa of Avila, and John of the Cross with the four.
So you didn't. It wasn't just medieval. It was you did early modern as well.
Yes. So maybe that's what it was. Yes. I'm sure it was called the medieval mystics. So, but there is this power in the words, and they somehow in the text, and she isn't organizing God. Perhaps that's what it is. She isn't trying to organize God. And how right she is.
A few questions online for any of the members of the panel. A question over Julian's spirituality, questioning how on earth does being walled up within the Sullivan anchorage allow oneself to be thereby connected spiritually to the whole of the cosmos and the creator of that cosmos?
Well, I suppose if you have a hazelnut, you're all right, aren't you? As Claire has expressed it. But I think these people did understand, as do religious still, that when you have a contemplative life, you're not shut away, but you're praying for. They are connected, and people would be asking them to pray for them too. They do understand their connectedness to the rest of the world. It's not a way of shutting yourself apart.
And there's a very strange thing. It's not just telepathy. If you speak to people who've given themselves to the contemplative life, that they seem to be extraordinarily aware of the world and of what's going on in the world. Often more than one is oneself, who's just had barrage of Radio 4 and Channel 4 News and everything else going on in one ear and out of the other. The contemplative who hasn't got a so much as a radio set or an iPhone, can be aware of it in a most extraordinary way, and I imagine she was like that. I imagine when she talks about the sufferings of the world and the Crusades and the plagues and so forth, they're very vivid to her in her cell.
I think it goes back a little bit to what I've been finding talking about this idea of separation and cut-offness and boredom, and as if the only knowledge and wisdom there is all on the outside of us and has to come to us, but there's that which emerges from within as well.
I was very interested by what you said. It's a paradoxical sentence, this. I was very interested by what you said about boredom. Because in a way, the reason that she is as she is that you imagine she was incapable of being bored, as a matter of fact.
Possibly.
Well, in medieval times, boredom, acidity, was a sin. It's a sin in Dante, isn't it? And we tend to think, oh, how can boredom be a sin? But it means being defeated, failing to see the joy in life as well.
We are really addicted to external stimulus, aren't we? Our bloody phones.
We've got time just for one more question, so I'll look to the room first if anyone has a question here. If not, there's a great question also online. Any takers?
Lady at the back there.
Lady at the back, thank you very much. You want to wait for the microphone just to come up to you so everyone can hear you?
We have the great question online as well.
We can have that one as well, but 60 seconds to answer it.
Hello, my first interest in her was seeing the cell that she sort of lived in Norwich, I think Cathedral, and I just wonder how much I've become very curious about her since then, and I wonder how much our religion plays in our interest in her. It's like I was born a Catholic, I'm lapsed, but I wonder how much interest she is to, say, like Muslims or Jewish people. But I think she's very special to Christians and women, and I just wonder what you think about that. And maybe that's just a thought. No answer.
I certainly know a Muslim theologian who's very committed to her, a man, and I know a lot of men who certainly, anecdotal, but...
Yes, I mean, I would have thought she was of universal interest. I don't know how well known she is in the great world, but I would have thought she was, for the reasons you state, that she's so arresting, isn't she? She's so original.
And it's really interesting to see where she was.
It is fascinating to see the plays.
We'll turn to the last question, which I'll draw from online, because it is a great question. Andrew mentioned earlier that Julian prays for illness, and it's a very strange thing to pray for. She's praying to share in suffering and the suffering of Christ. Someone online asks, how can dealing with personal pain, like Julian, help others to deal with theirs? And that's to everyone.
Well, you've written about this.
I have, yes. I think the others should speak first and then...
Oh, no, I was thinking, therefore, you should speak.
Well, she helped me enormously. I mean, that's what this book is about, really. That pain. We will all have pain and suffering. It will come to us in one form or another. Quite often, the worst suffering is witnessing the suffering of a loved one, in which she talks about, because she witnesses the suffering of Christ, and this is hell. This is terrible to her, and you receive it. I mean, I really was very active in my. It was the treatment, not the cancer itself. I never felt the symptoms of it. It was the treatment that was absolutely terrible. And I walk for 2.5 years, every week, walk towards the tunnel of hard things as you go to the cancer centre, you have the chemotherapy, and then 24 hours of hell afterwards. And I was never able to control the sickness. because the drugs that were strong enough to control the sickness gave me catastrophic constipation. And there's a passage in the story which is taken from real life. And so knowing this, I would consciously dress really well and put makeup on and jewellery and walk and open my heart, as it were, and walk towards this tunnel of hard things and go in. And as soon as you enter it with that openness, what you notice, so there are the hard things, and then there are the interstices, and in the interstices are extraordinary things, like watching someone who's clearly just had some sort of awful thing, he's feeling absolutely dreadful, followed by his wife, who was just so attentive and watching out for him so he could just focus on doing what he needed to do, which was to get to the door and get to wherever he could so he could rest and recover. And there was this care happening all around him. Watching someone who looked a little bit like you, Andrew, sitting at a table in the cancer centre where you could do jigsaw puzzles and he was just, I don't know what he was doing, something very simple. It might even have been colouring in. And it was so sweet, this what we are reduced to in our common humanity and the love that was everywhere until the interstices became bigger than the hard things. And they just grew and grew and grew. And then that's what you saw. And she taught me that.
I think that's a wonderful note to end on. I want to give a huge thanks to Claire, to Janet, and Andrew. As you can see, books are available for purchase and I assume to be signed by Claire. Huge thanks to everyone for coming this evening, whether in person or online.